Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another scary story. Your place where we uncover the darkest mysteries in a calming and reflective way. For the next hour, I want you to put on your earphones, put your phone face down, and close your eyes. Relax, and let this story take you to a world full of chills and mystery. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, leave a comment sharing where in the world you're listening from. Now get comfortable and relax. I never liked my dad's house. It was a small single-story place on Cedarwood Drive in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. The kind of house you'd pass without thinking twice. Just another outdated home with a cracked driveway and a mailbox missing half its numbers. Dad had bought it after the divorce, probably the best he could afford, but it never felt like home. There was always something off about it. Maybe it was the smell, a mix of old wood and something stale, like the air had been trapped inside for years. Maybe it was the way the floors creaked no matter where you stepped, or how the house always felt just a little too cold, even in the summer. Or maybe it was just the fact that it wasn't Mom's house. I was 10 when the divorce happened. My younger brother Josh was 6. We spent weekdays with Mom in our childhood home and weekends with Dad in this place that never really felt like ours. Josh didn't seem to care. He adjusted quickly, always finding the bright side of things. But I hated being there. I never told Dad how I felt. He was trying his best, I guess. He worked long hours at a manufacturing plant, coming home exhausted most nights, reheating frozen dinners while Josh and I played video games in our room. He wasn't a bad dad, just distant, like he didn't know what to do with us when we were there. The first time it happened, I was sleeping in Josh's room. We had a bunk bed and I always took the top. That night I woke up suddenly, no reason, no sound, just wide awake. And then I saw myself. I was standing in the doorway. At first I thought maybe I was still dreaming, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw the details. My face, my clothes, even the way I stood. It was me, just staring at my own sleeping body. My chest tightened. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, wake Josh up, something, anything, but I couldn't move. Then, in an instant, it was gone. I bolted upright, gasping. The doorway was empty. The only sound was Josh's slow, steady breathing from the bunk below. My hands were shaking. My skin was clammy. I sat there staring into the dark hallway, waiting. Nothing. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. And I knew, whatever was in that house, whatever had been watching me, this was only the beginning. I didn't tell anyone about what I saw. Not Dad, not Josh, not even Mom when we went back to her house on Sunday night. I didn't know how to explain it without sounding crazy. Besides, maybe it was just a dream. A weird, terrifying dream. That's what I told myself. But deep down, I knew better. The next weekend, we were back at Dad's. Josh was excited because he had a new game for his PlayStation, some racing game he'd been begging for. Dad had picked it up at a pawn shop on his way home from work, probably hoping it would keep us busy while he spent the night watching TV in the living room. I tried to act normal, like nothing had happened. I played video games with Josh, ate the frozen pizza Dad had tossed in the oven, and even let my little brother win a few races. But as the night went on, I couldn't shake the feeling. That house had a way of watching you. It was subtle, just a feeling at first. Like the air got heavier when the sun went down, like something was in the corners of the rooms, just out of sight. The feeling got worse as bedtime got closer. Josh fell asleep easily, as usual. I climbed into the top bunk, pulling the blanket up to my chin, staring at the ceiling. I kept telling myself I was being stupid. But then it happened again. I wasn't sure what woke me. I just remember feeling that same awful wrongness in the air, the same tightness in my chest. I turned my head toward the doorway. It was there again. Not me this time. Something else. A shape. Tall, thin, blacker than the darkness around it. It wasn't standing in the doorway this time, it was closer, inside the room. right next to Josh's bed. I froze. It wasn't moving, just standing there, hunched slightly like it was listening. The only sound in the room was Josh's slow, even breathing. I couldn't see its face, if it even had one, but I knew it, was looking at him. Then slowly it turned toward me. My whole body went cold. I wanted to scream, to move, to do something, but I couldn't. The air in my lungs felt trapped, like I was drowning. And then, just like before, it was gone. I gasped, finally able to breathe again. I sat up so fast I nearly smacked my head on the ceiling. My hands were shaking. My heart was racing. I leaned over the side of the bunk and looked at Josh. He was fine, still curled up under his blanket, completely unaware. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I told myself I imagined it, but I knew the truth. Whatever was in that house, it wasn't just watching me anymore. I was watching Josh, too. The next weekend, we didn't go to Dad's. It was a Wednesday when it happened. I remember because it was a school night, and Mom was supposed to pick us up from soccer practice. She never showed. At first, I wasn't worried. Maybe she got stuck in traffic or lost track of time. But when one of the coaches came over and told me he had been trying to call her, something in my stomach twisted. Dad showed up instead. His face was pale, his jaw tight. He barely looked at us as he told us to get in the car. I asked him what was going on, but he just shook his head. We drove in silence. It wasn't until we got home, Dad's home, not Mom's, that he sat us down in the living room. "There was an accident," he said, his voice hoarse. "Your mom..." He stopped, cleared his throat. "She didn't make it." I don't remember much after that. Just the sound of Josh crying, the way Dad looked so lost, like he didn't know what to do, like he was barely holding himself together. Mom was gone. Just like that. The funeral was a blur. Family members I hadn't seen in years came up to hug us, telling us how sorry they were, how Mom was such a wonderful person. I barely heard them. I just kept thinking about how this wasn't real, how any second now I was going to wake up. But I didn't. After the funeral, we stayed at Dad's full time. Mom's house was sold within weeks, most of her stuff packed up and donated. It felt like she disappeared overnight, like someone had erased her. But I knew she wasn't gone, because a week after the funeral, I saw her. It was late, maybe past midnight. Josh was asleep, and Dad had gone to bed hours ago. I was lying, awake, staring at the ceiling when I felt it, that same heavy wrongness in the air. I turned my head toward the doorway. Mom was standing there. Her face was pale, almost too pale, and her dark hair hung in loose waves around her shoulders. She was wearing the same blue sweater she had on the last time I saw her. But something was off. Her eyes, they were too dark, hollow, like she wasn't really seeing me. I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She lifted a hand, reaching toward me. Then, just like before, she was gone. I sat up fast, my breath coming in short gasps. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. I wanted to believe it was a dream, just grief messing with my head. But deep down, I knew the truth. Mom was still here, and something else was too. After that night, I started seeing her more. At first, it was just glimpses, reflections in the windows, a flash of blue in the hallway. I'd wake up in the middle of the night and swear I heard her voice, soft and distant, like she was calling my name from another room. I never told Dad. He barely talked anymore, spending most nights sitting in front of the TV with a beer in his hand. Josh was too young to understand what was happening, and I didn't want to scare him. But I was scared. The house felt different after Mom died. Darker, heavier. I couldn't explain it, but the air itself seemed thicker, like it was pressing down on me. And the thing I saw that night, the tall black figure that had stood next to Josh's bed, I knew it hadn't left. It was getting bolder. One night, a few weeks after the funeral, I woke up to the sound of whispering. At first I thought it was Josh talking in his sleep. But when I looked over the edge of the bunk bed, he was curled up, fast asleep. The whispering didn't stop. It was coming from the hallway. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding as I forced myself to sit up. The room was dark, but the hallway was even darker. The whispering was low and constant, like a conversation just out of earshot. I climbed down from the bed as quietly as I could. My feet hit the cold wood floor and I hesitated. I didn't want to go out there, but something made me. I stepped into the hallway, my breath shaky. The whispering stopped. The house was silent. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I turned my head toward the living room. Something was standing there, tall, thin, blacker than the shadows around it. It didn't move, didn't breathe, just watched me. My throat tightened. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't move. It was like that first time all over again when I saw myself standing in the doorway. Then it took a step forward. That broke the spell. I stumbled backward, slamming into the wall. My breath hitched, and I scrambled back into my room, throwing myself into bed and yanking the covers over my head like a little kid. My whole body was shaking. I didn't sleep that night. And after that, I stopped pretending. Whatever was in this house wasn't just watching anymore. It was coming closer. By the time summer rolled around, I couldn't take it anymore. The shadows weren't just in the hallway at night. They were everywhere. I'd see them in the corners of my eyes while I did my homework, feel them watching me when I sat on the couch with Josh playing video games. Even in the middle of the day, the house felt wrong, like something was waiting. I wasn't sleeping, I wasn't eating much either. Dad didn't notice. He was too wrapped up in his own grief. Josh was too young to understand, and I was too scared to say anything. Then Dad told us we were going to the cabin. It was a last-minute thing. Some guy from work had a place up near Backbone State Park and offered to let us use it for a weekend. Dad thought it would be good for us to get away. I didn't care where we went as long as it wasn't here. I thought maybe the cabin would be safe. Maybe whatever was in Dad's house wouldn't follow us. I was wrong. The cabin was small, tucked deep in the woods. No neighbors, no streetlights, just trees and the sound of cicadas buzzing in the heat. It should have been peaceful, but the second we stepped inside, I felt it. The air was heavy, thick, like the house back home, like something was already here. That night, I slept on the couch in the living room while Josh and Dad took the bedrooms. I kept the lamp on, trying to convince myself that nothing would happen, that this was just a stupid fear I couldn't shake. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. Then I realized the air had changed. It was colder, and I wasn't alone. I turned my head slowly, and there it was, the shadow. But this time, it wasn't just standing there. It was crawling out of the wall. Its body twisted and stretched as it pulled itself through, like it wasn't made for this world, like it was forcing itself into existence. The closer it got, the worse the air felt, thick and choking, like I was breathing in smoke. I wanted to scream, wanted to run, but I couldn't move. Then, from behind me, I heard a voice, soft, familiar. Go. A cold hand touched my shoulder, and suddenly I could breathe again. The weight lifted, my body unfroze. I bolted upright, gasping. The shadow was gone, and standing in its place just for a second was Mom. She was pale, faded, but she was there. Her dark hair hung loose, her blue sweater soft against the dim light. She smiled. Then she was gone. After that weekend, things changed. The house still felt wrong, but the shadows weren't as strong. The whispering faded. Whatever had been watching me, hunting me, it wasn't gone, but it wasn't winning anymore. Because I wasn't alone. Mom was still here, and she was protecting us. I never told Dad, never told Josh, but I knew, deep down, that something had followed us home from that cabin, and it was waiting. But now, I wasn't just waiting back, I was ready. It all started when she moved into an apartment in an old building on Sycamore Street in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The building had been around since the 1960s, sturdy brick construction, narrow hallways with faded floral carpeting and the kind of yellowed ceiling tiles that hinted at years of cigarette smoke from long-gone tenants. It wasn't fancy, but for a 23-year-old fresh out of college, it was affordable and had charm. Emily moved in with her boyfriend Jake, a solid guy, worked as an auto mechanic, always had grease under his nails, and treated my daughter, well, they had been dating for a little over a year, and while I worried about them moving in together so soon, they seemed happy. That's what mattered. The apartment itself had a strange feel. Not menacing, just off. The air was always a little too still, and the place never seemed to warm up, even in the summer. The neighbors kept to themselves, and there was an eerie quietness to the building, as if the walls absorbed sound instead of carrying it. Emily mentioned feeling uneasy sometimes, like someone was watching her, but I chalked it up to adjusting to a new place. A few months passed, and things took a turn. Emily called me one night, her voice shaky. "Mom, something weird happened." I sat up in bed, instantly alert. "What do you mean?" "I was watching TV, and out of nowhere, one of our DVD cases just flew off the entertainment center. It didn't fall, it flew. It smacked against the opposite wall." I hesitated. "Maybe it was sitting on the edge and just tipped over?" "No," she insisted. "Jake was with me. He saw it too. It had force behind it, like someone threw it." I didn't know what to say. I wanted to tell her it was nothing, but she sounded genuinely scared. "Maybe the place has bad wiring or something. Could be static electricity," I said, though I didn't believe my own words. "Yeah, maybe," she muttered, but she didn't sound convinced either. Then came the recording. Emily had an old digital voice recorder she used for college lectures. One night, for no real reason, she decided to turn it on and let it run while she and Jake were hanging out in the living room. They weren't ghost hunters, just curious. The next morning she played it back, and there it was. Between their casual conversation and the sound of the TV in the background, a voice, a raspy, unnatural whisper, cut through the recording. It wasn't theirs. It wasn't human. "Get out," it hissed. Emily sent me the clip. I listened to it over and over, hoping I could explain it away. Maybe it was interference, a trick of the sound waves. But the more I listened, the less I could deny it. Something was in that apartment, and it wanted them gone. After that recording, things escalated. At first it was small, lights flickering, doors creaking open on their own. Things you could explain away. But then the feeling of being watched became constant, thick in the air like humidity before a storm. Emily started sleeping with the bedroom door locked. "Mom, I swear I saw something in the hallway last night," she told me over the phone a few days later. I gripped the receiver tighter. "What do you mean, something?" She exhaled shakily. "I don't know." I got up to use the bathroom, and out of the corner of my eye I saw something standing near the coat rack by the door. It was tall, darker than the shadows. I thought it was Jake at first, but he was asleep. When I turned my head, it was gone. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her she was just seeing things, but the fear in her voice told me this was real to her. "Have you told Jake?" "Yeah," she sighed. "He's been trying to act like it's nothing, but I can tell it's getting to him too. Last night he woke up gasping, said he felt like something was sitting on his chest, like he couldn't move." I shivered. Sleep paralysis. I had read about it before. People describe a shadowy figure pressing down on them, unable to breathe, unable to scream. "Maybe you guys should think about breaking your lease," I suggested. "Find somewhere else to stay." "We can't afford to break it, Mom. We barely saved enough to move in." I didn't push it, but I hated the idea of her staying in that place. A week later, Jake called me. He rarely called. Usually I just got texts from him, but that night his number lit up my screen around 11:30 p.m. "Hey Jake, what's up?" I asked, already sensing something was wrong. His voice was low, tense. "I need to ask you something. Have you ever heard Emily sleep talking?" I frowned. "Not that I remember." "Why?" He let out a breath. Because last night she sat up in bed, like straight up, and started talking in this weird voice. Not her voice. It was deep, almost like a growl. She said, "He's coming." Then she just laid back down, like nothing happened. A chill ran through me. Did she remember anything in the morning? No. She looked at me like I was crazy when I told her. I swallowed hard. I had no explanation for that. I wanted to tell him to pack their things and run, but I knew they felt stuck. Then, the worst thing yet happened. It was a Friday night. Emily and Jake had a couple of friends over, trying to lighten the mood, pretending things were normal. One of the friends, a girl named Amber, decided to take a picture of them all sitting on the couch. When they looked at the photo, their smiles vanished. In the reflection of the TV screen standing behind the couch was a figure. It was blurry, a misty outline of something tall, its face just a smudge of darkness. But the worst part? It was right behind Jake. After that night, everything changed. Emily called me the next morning, her voice shaking so badly I could barely understand her. "Mom, I can't stay here anymore. Something is..." She choked on the words. "Something is wrong with this place." I gripped the phone, heart pounding. "What happened?" She sniffled, trying to hold back tears. "Jake left in the middle of the night. He wouldn't tell me where he was going. He just grabbed his keys and left. I think something's messing with him, Mom." That didn't sound like Jake. He was solid, dependable, not the kind of guy to just disappear without a word. "Have you heard from him?" "No, his phone goes straight to voicemail." I tried to keep my voice steady, but I was worried now too. "Do you want me to come get you?" She hesitated, then whispered, "Yes." I didn't waste time. I threw on some jeans, grabbed my keys, and drove 30 minutes to her place. When I got there, she was already outside, sitting on the front steps in sweats, her arms wrapped around her knees. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, hair unbrushed. As soon as she saw me, she stood up and rushed to my car. "Let's go," she said, not even looking back at the building. I waited until we were on the road before I asked, "What else happened?" She swallowed hard. "After Jake left, I tried to sleep, but I kept hearing noises. Scratching inside the walls, then..." She paused, her fingers gripping her seatbelt. "Then I heard the recorder turn on." I glanced at her. "What do you mean?" "It was in the living room, on the coffee table. I wasn't anywhere near it, but I heard it beep, like a pressed record." A cold shiver ran through me. "Did you check it?" She nodded. "I played it back this morning." "And?" She didn't answer right away. Then, in a hollow voice, she said, "It was my voice, Mom, but I don't remember saying anything." A lump formed in my throat. "What did you say?" Emily turned to me, her face pale. I said, "He's already here." I pressed the gas pedal harder, suddenly desperate to put distance between us and that apartment. By the next afternoon, Jake still hadn't come back. His phone remained off. None of his friends had heard from him, and his family was starting to get worried. Then just after sunset, a police officer knocked on my door. Emily froze when she saw him. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." The officer took off his hat and cleared his throat. "Are you Emily Parker?" She nodded slowly, gripping my arm. "I'm sorry to inform you, but your boyfriend, Jacob Harris, was found deceased this morning." The room tilted. Emily's knees buckled, and I caught her before she hit the floor. "What?" My voice cracked. "What happened?" The officer hesitated, his expression unreadable. "He was found in his car at a rest stop off the highway. No signs of foul play, just sitting there, like he went to sleep and never woke up." Emily made a choking sound, her fingers digging into my arm. The officer shifted uncomfortably. "One more thing." He pulled something from his pocket, a small digital recorder. He was holding this when they found him. Emily and I stared at it, neither of us reaching for it. The officer cleared his throat. Would you like it back? Emily's voice was barely a whisper. No. The days after Jake's death passed in a blur. Emily barely spoke, barely ate. She stayed curled up in the guest room at my house, staring at the wall. I had never seen her like that before, like all the light had gone out of her. The police ruled it as natural causes, said there was nothing suspicious, but how does a healthy 25-year-old man just die in his car with no explanation? No drugs, no alcohol, no signs of trauma, just gone. Emily didn't go back to the apartment. I didn't ask her to. I went instead, packed up her things while she stayed home, numb and silent. The place felt different when I stepped inside. Heavy, like the air had weight to it. I moved quickly, stuffing clothes into bags, throwing toiletries into a box. I didn't want to be there longer than I had to. And then I saw it. On the living room wall, above the couch, was something I knew hadn't been there before. Scratch, marks, long, jagged scratches in the paint, 5 parallel lines like claw marks. I grabbed the last of her things and slammed the door behind me, leaving the keys on the counter. We weren't coming back. A week after the funeral, Emily finally left the house for the first time. She wanted to visit Jake's grave. It was a small cemetery just outside the city, quiet and well kept. She knelt beside the fresh dirt, fingers tracing his name on the headstone, whispering something I couldn't hear. Then she pulled out her phone and took a picture. Later that night, I heard her scream. I ran into the guest room, finding her sitting up in bed, the phone clutched in her hands. She was shaking. "Emily, what's wrong?" She didn't answer, just turned the screen toward me. It was the photo she had taken at the cemetery, but there was something in it that shouldn't have been there. Mist. A swirling, smoky mist, rising up from the ground behind Jake's headstone. It had no shape, no clear form, but there was something off about it. It wasn't foggy. It wasn't a trick of the light. And in the center of the mist, there was a shadow. A figure. Tall. Watching. I grabbed the phone, my hands cold. "Emily, this wasn't there when you took the picture?" She shook her head, tears spilling down her face. "No." We stared at it together, the silence thick between us. Then she whispered, "Mom, do you think it was him?" I swallowed hard. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to tell her that it was Jake, that he was still with her, that love doesn't just disappear. But I couldn't, because deep down, I didn't think it was Jake at all. I thought it was something else, something that had been following them long before he died. And now, it knew where we lived. Emily never went back to Sycamore Street. She deleted the photo. She refused to talk about the recorder, the scratches, the mist, but she never stopped looking over her shoulder. And sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet, I swear I hear whispers in the dark. I grew up in Madison County, Kentucky, a quiet rural area where life moved a little slower. My family's land had been passed down for generations, originally settled by my great-great-grandfather in the late 1800s. It wasn't much, about 100 acres of rolling hills, thick woods, and a creek that cut through the back of the property. But it was ours. The land had a way of holding on to things, memories mostly, but also stories. My grandfather, William Dawson, had lived there his whole life. He raised cattle, grew tobacco, and taught my brothers and me everything we knew about farming. He believed the land was alive in its own way. "It remembers," he used to say, "good and bad." After my grandfather passed, my Aunt Lorraine and I took over the farm. She was a tough woman, fiercely independent, no nonsense, the kind of person who could shoot a rattlesnake with one hand and make homemade biscuits with the other. She never married, never had kids of her own, but she took in my cousin, David, after his parents split up. Lorraine lived in a small double-wide trailer at the back of the property, close to the woods. She liked the solitude, said it gave her peace. But that part of the land always felt different. Even as kids, we avoided going too deep into the woods near her trailer. It wasn't anything we could explain, just a feeling, something to watch. I spent most of my summers on the farm, working with my brothers and David, fixing fences, baling hay, riding four-wheelers through the fields. It was a good life, simple, predictable, until the summer of 1998 when Lorraine started hearing the voice. At first we thought she was just messing with us. But the way she looked when she talked about it, calm but serious, made me wonder if she wasn't telling the truth. And then, one night, I heard it too. The summer of 1998 was hotter than usual, the kind of heat that clung to your skin even after the sun went down. I had just turned 19 and was spending the break helping out on the farm before heading back to school in the fall. My cousin David was a year younger than me, lanky and always full of energy. We spent our days fixing fences, tending to the cattle, and sneaking off in the evenings to drink beer by the creek when Aunt Lorraine wasn't watching. Lorraine had always been the no-nonsense type. She never complained, never got spooked, and never let anything shake her. That's why, when she started talking about hearing a voice, none of us knew what to make of it. "It's just the wind," David said one night as we sat on the porch, swatting at mosquitoes. Lorraine, sitting in her usual rocking chair with a cigarette balanced between her fingers, shook her head. "Wind, don't say my name," she said flatly. I frowned. "What exactly did you hear?" She took a slow drag from her cigarette, exhaled, and looked out toward the woods. "First time was last week. I was out by the barn after sundown checking on the horses. Heard someone say Lorraine real soft, like they were standing just a few feet away." David smirked. "Maybe you got a secret admirer." She shot him a look that shut him up real quick. It wasn't any damn admirer. It was a woman's voice. And when I turned around, no one was there. That was enough to make the hair on my arm stand up. Lorraine wasn't one to make things up. "You think someone's messing with you?" I asked. "Maybe some of the neighbors?" She shook her head again. "Ain't nobody close enough to be sneaking around without me seeing them." That was true. The nearest house was a half-mile down the road, and you'd hear a car coming long before it got anywhere near the house. Still, I figured it was just one of those things. A trick of the wind, an animal in the brush, something that made her think she heard a voice when she really didn't. But then a few nights later I heard it too. David and I had stayed up late watching some old Western on TV while Lorraine went to bed early. Around midnight, we finally shut it off and stepped outside to cool off before heading to bed. The crickets were loud, and a warm breeze rustled through the trees. That's when I heard it. Clear as day. A woman's voice. It was soft, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. "Lorraine." David and I froze. I turned to look at him, my heart hammering. His face had gone pale, his mouth slightly open. "You heard that, right?" I whispered. He swallowed hard. "Yeah, I did." We both turned to look toward the woods, but there was nothing there. Just the thick line of trees, dark and unmoving. Neither of us said another word. We just backed up toward the trailer, locking the door behind us. That night I didn't sleep. And for the first time, I wondered if maybe Lorraine had been right all along. Something, or someone, was out there. After that night, neither David nor I joked about the voice again. We didn't talk about it much at all, really. Not because we weren't thinking about it, but because something about saying it out loud made it feel too real. Lorraine, on the other hand, didn't seem fazed. If anything, she acted like it was just another part of life. "It don't mean no harm," she said one morning over coffee. I stared at her, still groggy from another sleepless night. "You don't think it's weird? A voice calling your name out in the middle of the night?" She shrugged. "Ain't the first time I've heard things on this land, won't be the last." That didn't make me feel any better. David, who had been unusually quiet since that night, finally spoke up. "If it don't mean no harm, then what does it want?" Lorraine stirred her coffee, looking thoughtful. Maybe a warning. Maybe just letting me know it's here. That was the last thing I wanted to hear. That evening, I tried to shake the feeling of unease by keeping busy. David and I worked late, cleaning out the barn and making repairs on the fence near the horse pasture. By the time we finished, the sun had dipped below the hills and a soft purple hue stretched across the sky. "Let's get inside," David muttered, tossing his gloves into the back of the truck. I didn't argue. As we crossed the yard toward the trailer, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. My breath hitched and I stopped. "Did you see that?" I whispered. David froze. "What?" I turned my head slowly, scanning the edge of the woods. At first, nothing looked out of place. Just trees, shadows stretching long in the fading light. Then I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the tree line. A woman. She was too far to make out clearly, but there was something unnatural about the way she stood. Too still, almost, like she wasn't really there. My chest tightened. Every instinct told me to run, but I couldn't move. Then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. I blinked, my heart racing. David. Before I could say another word, we heard it. Footsteps. Not ours. Not an animal. Heavy, deliberate footsteps moving across the dry grass. They were coming from behind us. David's eyes widened, and without a word, we both ran the last few steps to the trailer, slamming the door behind us. Lorraine was already standing in the kitchen, her arms crossed. "You saw her, didn't you?" I swallowed hard, my hands still shaking. "Who is she?" Lorraine exhaled, looking toward the window. I think it's my sister." The words sent a chill through me. Lorraine's sister had died years ago, and if that was her out there, then something was very, very wrong. I didn't know much about Lorraine's sister, and I had never thought to ask. She was just a name I had heard in passing, someone long gone before I ever came around. But that night, sitting at the small kitchen table with my hands still shaking, I needed answers. Lorraine sat across from me, calm as ever. The only sign that she was rattled was the way she tapped her fingers against the rim of her coffee cup. David sat beside me, arms crossed tight, his knee bouncing under the table. "You really think it's her?" I finally asked. Lorraine nodded. "I do." David scoffed, rubbing his hands over his face. "That don't make any sense. She's been dead. For what, 30 years? 32, Lorraine corrected. She died in a car accident just outside of Athens. I shifted in my seat, feeling a chill creep up my spine. She was 22, Lorraine continued. Had her whole life ahead of her. She was planning to move to Cincinnati, start fresh, but she never made it. A drunk driver hit her head on, killed her instantly. The room was silent except for the hum of the old fridge. I swallowed hard. So why would she be here now? Lorraine didn't answer right away. She stared down into her coffee, as if searching for the right words. "I think she's trying to warn us," she said finally. David frowned. "Warn us about what?" Lorraine hesitated, then let out a slow breath. "That car she died in? It was a '66 Mustang, red. She loved that damn thing." I didn't understand what she was getting at until I looked at David. His face had gone pale. He was saving up for a car. Had been talking about it all summer. A '66 Mustang, red. "No," David muttered, shaking his head. "That's just a coincidence." Lorraine gave him a long, steady look. Maybe, but none of us believed that. I sat back, exhaling shakily. "You think she doesn't want you to get that car?" David didn't answer. He just stared down at the table, jaw clenched. The room felt heavier now, like something unseen had settled in the space between us. A sudden knock at the window made me jump. David and I both turned sharply, our hearts pounding, but there was nothing outside, just darkness. Lorraine didn't flinch. She just sipped her coffee. "She won't hurt us," she murmured. "She just wants us to listen." None of us slept that night. And by morning, David had made up his mind. He wasn't buying that car. David never spoke about the Mustang after that night. The excitement he once had about buying the car was gone, replaced by a quiet unease he refused to acknowledge. I didn't push him on it. Some things didn't need to be discussed. Life on the farm went back to normal, or as normal as it could be after something like that. The air felt lighter, the nights quieter. Lorraine still kept to her usual ways, drinking coffee on the porch every morning and muttering to herself when she thought no one was listening. But something about her seemed different. Not scared, not shaken, just thoughtful. 2 weeks passed without incident. No more footsteps in the dark, no more whispers, no more shadows shifting at the edge of the woods. Whatever had been out there seemed to have moved on. Then, one evening, as the sun was setting, I found Lorraine standing at the edge of the yard, looking toward the tree line. I walked up beside her. "You see something?" She shook her head but didn't look away. "I just feel her." I followed her gaze, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, their leaves rustling gently in the breeze. "She's gone, isn't she?" I asked. Lorraine nodded. "Yeah, I think she was just waiting to make sure we listened." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just stood there, watching as the last bit of sunlight disappeared beyond the hills. That night something woke me up. A noise, soft, almost like fabric brushing against the floor. I sat up slowly, listening. The house was silent. Then, just as I was about to lay back down, I heard it. A single word. "Goodbye." A woman's voice, barely more than a whisper, drifting through the air like a fading echo. I didn't feel fear. Just a strange, quiet peace. David heard it too. I knew because the next morning he didn't say a word about it. He just gave me a look over breakfast, one that told me he didn't need confirmation. He knew what we had heard. A week later, Lorraine packed up and left the farm, said she was ready to move on, that it was time to live closer to family. She hugged me before she left. "Some ghosts aren't here to haunt," she said softly. "Some just want to be remembered." And then she was gone. David and I stayed on the farm for another year before moving out. Life went on, the way it always does. But every now and then, when I pass by an old red Mustang on the road, I feel a chill run down my spine, and I wonder what might have happened if David hadn't listened. Some warnings, I think, are worth heeding. In the summer of 2009, my wife Sarah and I moved to her family's old farm in Lexington, Kentucky. The property had been in her family for decades, passed down from her grandfather, a stubborn old man who built most of the house with his own hands. It was the kind of place that felt frozen in time, rolling fields, a weathered barn, and a house that creaked with every step. The house sat on about 10 acres of land, surrounded by dense woods that stretched for miles. It was peaceful, but also eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that made you feel like you weren't alone. The nearest neighbor was a mile down the road, and at night the only sound was the wind rustling through the old oak trees. I had never been much of a country guy. I grew up in Cincinnati, used to the constant noise of traffic, streetlights, glowing at all hours, and the general hum of city life. But Sarah loved this place. It was home to her, so I told myself I'd get used to it. I just didn't expect her mother, Margaret, to move in with us. Margaret was in her late 60s, Cherokee on her father's side, and devoutly Catholic from her mother's influence. She carried her faith like armor, always wearing a small silver cross around her neck. But she wasn't the warm, grandmotherly type. She was sharp, strict, and made it clear from the start that she didn't trust me. From the moment I met her, I knew she didn't like me. She never said it outright, but the disapproving looks, the way she dismissed everything I said, the passive-aggressive remarks, it was obvious. She thought Sarah could have done better. Maybe she was right. I wasn't anything special, just a guy trying to make ends meet, working construction jobs while figuring out what came next. But I loved Sarah, and I thought that should have been enough. Sarah always told me to ignore her mother. "She's just old-fashioned," she'd say. "She doesn't mean anything by it." But I wasn't so sure. There was something about Margaret, a presence, a weight she carried that filled the house. It wasn't just her attitude that made things difficult. There was something else. The house felt different when she was around. At first I thought it was just me adjusting to the old place. The air always felt thick, heavy, like there was something unseen pressing against your chest. The house groaned in a way that wasn't normal. Doors creaked even when no one was near them. Floorboards settled like someone was walking through the empty halls at night. Margaret's room was on the first floor, near the back of the house. And sometimes, late at night, I swore I heard whispers coming from under her door. Not prayers, just low, unintelligible murmuring. I never mentioned it to Sarah. I told myself it was just my imagination. Then one night, everything changed. It started with the wind. That night, Sarah had gone into town to visit a friend, leaving me alone with Margaret. The house was quiet, except for the occasional creak of old wood settling. I had spent most of the evening outside, locking up the barn and checking the fences. There had been reports of coyotes in the area, and the last thing I wanted was to wake up and find one had gotten into the chicken coop. By the time I was done, it was late, close to 11 p.m., and the air was still, heavy with the smell of damp earth. The sky was cloudless, and the moon cast long shadows over the fields. Then, without warning, a freezing gust of wind shot through the yard. I staggered back, my breath catching in my throat. 1 second, the air had been warm, humid from the Kentucky summer. The next, it was like I had stepped into the dead of winter. The cold was unnatural, not like a normal breeze, but sharp, cutting through my clothes like a knife. I glanced up at the trees surrounding the property. The leaves weren't moving. The branches remained still, but I could feel it. A chill crept up my spine, and for the first time since moving in, I felt watched. Then, from inside the house, I heard it. Knocking. It was deep and rhythmic. Thud, 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 coming from above me, the attic. I turned toward the house, my heart hammering. The attic door was in the hallway near Margaret's room. We rarely went up there. It was mostly storage. Old furniture, boxes of Sarah's childhood things, a few dusty suitcases from Margaret's past. There was no reason for anything to be moving up there. I took a slow breath, trying to steady myself. Maybe it was a loose shutter banging against the siding. Maybe a raccoon had gotten in somehow. I told myself anything other than what my gut was screaming, that something was in the attic. I stepped onto the porch, my boots thudding against the wood. As I reached for the door handle, I heard a soft whimper. Tucker, our dog, was crouched low near the steps, his tail tucked between his legs. His ears were flattened, and he was staring at the house, growling low in his throat. I had never seen him act like that before. I knelt down, reaching out a hand. "Come on, boy. It's okay." He didn't move. Then, as if something invisible had rushed past him, Tucker let out a sharp yelp and bolted. He ran across the yard, disappearing into the dark, leaving me alone with that knocking sound. I stood there, frozen, listening, thud, thud, thud. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. The silence was worse. I pushed open the door and stepped inside, the weight of the house pressing down on me. Margaret was sitting in the living room, staring at the ceiling, her face pale. Her fingers clutched the cross around her neck so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. She didn't look at me, but when she spoke, her voice was flat, distant. "They know I'm angry," she whispered. A cold wave of unease rolled through me. I swallowed hard. "Who?" I asked. Margaret finally turned her head, her dark eyes locking onto mine. She didn't answer, but the look in her eyes told me I wasn't going to like the truth. The house felt different after that night. It wasn't just in my head. The air was heavier, thicker, like the walls themselves were holding something in. The usual creaks and groans of the old wood seemed sharper, more deliberate, like the house wasn't just settling but shifting. Margaret barely spoke the next day. She moved through the house like a ghost herself, her eyes always distant, her fingers always clutching the cross around her neck. Every now and then, I'd catch her muttering under her breath, not prayers, but something else. Words I didn't recognize. That night, Sarah was home, but she had gone to bed early, exhausted from a long shift at work. Margaret stayed in her room, door shut tight. That left me alone in the living room, trying to distract myself with the old TV that barely picked up 3 channels. But I couldn't focus, because upstairs in the attic, The knocking started again. Thud, thud, thud. I turned off the TV and sat there, listening. It wasn't fast, not frantic. It was slow, steady, deliberate. I told myself it was nothing. Just an old house making old house noises. But deep down, I knew better. I stood up and made my way to the hallway. Margaret's door was shut, but from under the crack I could see her lamp was still on. She was awake. She was listening too. I swallowed hard and turned toward the attic door at the end of the hall. It was shut, just like it always was. But as I stepped closer, my stomach twisted into a knot, because something moved under the door. At first I thought it was just a shadow, maybe a trick of the dim light, but then it happened again. A long, thin shadow stretched across the floor, shifting like something was crawling on the other side. I stopped in my tracks. The hallway was silent now. The knocking had stopped, but the air felt wrong, like I wasn't alone. I took a slow breath and reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling. The second my fingers touched the brass, it turned on its own. I yanked my hand back as the door rattled violently, shaking in its frame, and then from the other side I heard a whisper, low, raspy, my name. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might explode. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The rattling ceased. The whisper vanished. The air in the hallway settled. The house was silent again. I stood there frozen, staring at the attic door. It was shut tight, like it had never moved at all. I turned, ready to wake Sarah, to tell her we had to leave, that something was wrong with this house. But before I could take a step, Margaret's door creaked open. She stood there in the dim light of her room, her face unreadable. "You shouldn't have gone near it," she said softly. Her voice was calm, too calm, like she had been expecting this, like she knew something I didn't. I didn't sleep that night. Even after the house went quiet, I sat awake in the living room, staring at the attic door from down the hall. Every part of me wanted to grab Sarah and get in the truck to drive as far from this place as possible, but I couldn't. Margaret knew something she wasn't saying. The next morning, she didn't act like anything was wrong. She made coffee, fed the chickens, and went about her day like usual. Sarah left early for work, oblivious to what had happened the night before. I waited until we were alone, then finally confronted her. "What happened last night?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Margaret didn't look up from the dough she was kneading. "You already know," she said. Her words sent a chill through me. "I don't, but I think you do." Margaret exhaled slowly, wiping her hands on a towel. She walked over to the kitchen table and sat down, motioning for me to do the same. "There are things in this world," she said quietly, "that feed on emotion, feed on anger, on fear, on resentment. Some places hold on to that energy longer than they should." I swallowed hard. "What does that have to do with the attic?" Margaret's gaze darkened. "That room was always different. My father refused to go up there. My mother too. They said the house had a way of reflecting what you brought into it. I thought about the way the air had felt heavy since we moved in, the way I had resented Margaret's presence, how she had resented mine. The fights, the tension, the unspoken words. "You think we caused this?" I asked. Margaret didn't answer, but she didn't have to. Without another word, she got up and disappeared into her bedroom. When she returned, she was carrying a bundle of dried sage, a vial of holy water, and a small leather pouch filled with something I didn't recognize. "We need to cleanse the house," she said. I didn't argue. Margaret started in the attic. She moved slowly, murmuring prayers under her breath as she waved the sage through the air. The smoke curled toward the ceiling, disappearing into the corners of the room. She sprinkled holy water along the doorframe, and the moment the droplets hit the wood, the air seemed to shift. A deep, low creaking filled the room, like the house itself was exhaling. I felt it then, the weight pressing down on my chest, the suffocating presence that had been lurking in the shadows. It didn't want to leave. Margaret threw a handful of powder from the leather pouch into the air. For a brief second, I thought I saw something. A shape, a face twisted in fury, before it vanished. Then, just like that, it was gone. The air lightened. The house fell silent. Margaret let out a shaky breath. "It's done," she whispered. I wasn't sure if I believed her, but for the first time in weeks, the house finally felt still. The house was quiet after that night. Not the unsettling, heavy silence that had pressed down on me before, but something different, lighter, like a storm had finally passed. Margaret didn't speak about what had happened. She went back to her routine, cooking breakfast early in the morning, tending to the garden, and reading on the porch in the afternoons. But something about her had changed. She looked tired. Not just physically, but in a way that made her seem smaller, as if some invisible weight had been lifted off her shoulders, but had left behind a deep exhaustion. Sarah noticed it too. "You've been acting strange," she said one night as we lay in bed. "And so has my mom. What's going on?" I wanted to tell her everything, the knocking, the whispers, the shadow in the attic, the way Margaret had performed what felt like some ancient ritual to drive whatever it was out of our home. But I didn't, because now that it was over, I wasn't sure I wanted to remember it. A few weeks later, Margaret packed up her things and told us she was moving in with her sister in Tennessee. Sarah was shocked. "What? Why? You love this place." Margaret just gave her a small, tired smile. "It's time for me to go." She hugged Sarah tightly and patted my shoulder as she passed me, pausing for just a second to meet my eyes. "Take care of each other," she said. And then she was gone. Sarah was heartbroken, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret had known something we didn't. That maybe she had been carrying something with her for a long time. Some guilt, some anger, and that whatever had haunted this house had fed off of it. Margaret leaving felt like closing a book that had been open for too long. The house never felt the same after that. It was still old, still creaky, but the air felt normal. No more weight pressing on my chest, no more shadows shifting where they shouldn't. It was just a house again. A year later, we moved too. Sarah got a new job in the city, and we decided it was time to start fresh. The house sat empty for a while before it was rented out to a new family. I never checked back to see if they had any problems. Maybe they never did. Or maybe whatever had been there was just waiting for someone else to bring their ghosts with them. I still don't believe in hauntings the way most people do. But I do believe that places hold on to things, emotions, memories, grief. And sometimes, when the weight of the past is too heavy, it looks for someone to carry it. I never considered myself superstitious. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, in a big, loud family that didn't have time for ghost stories. My mother always said that real life is scary enough, and she wasn't wrong. I spent most of my childhood in a cramped apartment with my parents and 3 siblings, so when I finally got married to Joe, the idea of moving into our own house felt like a dream. We found the house on West 52nd off Clark Avenue, a modest 2-story place with faded blue siding and a sagging porch. It wasn't much, but it was ours. The price was unbelievably low, which should have been my first red flag, but at the time I was too excited to care. It had been in Joe's family for years, passed down from his uncle Rubble, who had lived there alone until his death a few months before we moved in. Joe didn't talk much about him, just that he was a strange old man who kept to himself. The house had been sitting empty since then, gathering dust, waiting for someone to breathe life back into it. I wanted that someone to be us. We had 2 kids, Charlie, our youngest, full of boundless energy and mischief, and Mary, our quiet but curious daughter. They were thrilled about the move, especially Charlie, who was fascinated by the idea of having his own room for the first time. The first few weeks were uneventful. Sure, the house had its quirks. Floors that creaked when no one was walking, doors that refused to stay shut. But that's just what old houses do, right? But then, little things started happening. At first, I ignored them. A misplaced object, here. A flickering light there. Nothing I couldn't explain. Then one morning, I was making Charlie's bed when his radio turned on by itself. It wasn't just static. The dial turned on its own, flipping through stations before settling on a slow, eerie melody. I stared at it, frozen. Then, as if being moved by an unseen hand, the entire radio shifted slightly. The front of it turned until it was pointing directly at our dog, Samantha. She had been sick for weeks, old, frail, barely eating. She let out a soft whimper. That night, Samantha died. I tried to push it out of my mind, but a gnawing unease settled in my stomach. What if the radio had been a warning? I didn't know it then, but that was the moment everything changed. After Samantha died, things in the house felt different. At first, it was just a feeling, a heaviness in the air like something unseen had settled into the walls. I told myself it was just grief. Losing a pet, especially one that had been with us for years, leaves a mark. But deep down I knew it wasn't just that. The basement was where I felt it the most. It was an old, unfinished space with exposed pipes, cracked cement floors, and a single bare light bulb that cast more shadows than light. The previous owner, Joe's Uncle Rubble, had left behind a lot of junk. Rusted tools, broken furniture, old newspapers stacked in the corner. The air was always damp and stale, no matter how many times I left the door open to air it out. Laundry day was the worst. Our washer and dryer were down there, an old-fashioned wringer washer that groaned every time I used it. I hated going down there alone, but with Joe at work during the day, I didn't have a choice. The first time I felt it, I was bent over, pulling wet clothes from the washer. That feeling, the one that makes your skin crawl, the unmistakable sensation that someone is watching you. I froze, my hands gripping a damp shirt. The basement was silent except for the faint dripping of a pipe somewhere in the darkness. I turned my head slightly, listening. Nothing. I shook it off and went back to my laundry, forcing myself to hum a tune, anything to break the silence. "You're being ridiculous," I muttered. But as the weeks went on, that feeling never went away. I started talking to the empty space. "Just doing laundry," I'd say, as if announcing my presence to whatever might be lurking in the shadows. Not bothering anyone. It made me feel stupid, but somehow it helped. Until one morning when I heard it. I was alone folding towels on the rickety basement table when a voice, soft, raspy, whispered my name. "Mary, Mary, come here." I went cold. The voice came from the darkest corner of the basement, the one I never went near, the one where the old newspapers sat untouched, stacked high like a forgotten shrine. I spun around so fast I knocked the laundry basket over. No one was there. The air felt thicker, the dampness now suffocating. My heart slammed against my ribs as I stumbled backward toward the stairs. Then, footsteps. Faint, deliberate, moving toward me. I bolted. I never did laundry alone again. After that day in the basement, I did everything I could to avoid being down there alone. If Joe was home, I'd casually ask him to grab something from the washer. If the kids were around, I'd bring them with me under the excuse that I didn't want them playing too far away. But deep down, I knew something was there, watching, waiting. And it wasn't just in the basement anymore. The feeling started creeping upstairs. At first, it was subtle, a shift in the air, a flicker in the corner of my eye. I'd be making dinner and feel something standing behind me, close enough that I could swear I'd hear breathing. I'd turn around, expecting Joe or one of the kids, but there was never anyone there. Then the nights got worse. The first time it happened, I was drifting off to sleep when I felt it, warm breath on the back of my neck. I froze. Joe was on the other side of the bed, his back turned. The kids were in their rooms. So who was breathing on me? I lay there, every muscle locked in place, listening. The breathing was slow, deep, deliberate, like someone was standing right behind me watching. I wanted to move. I couldn't. It was like something was pressing down on me, pinning me to the mattress. My fingers twitched, but the rest of my body refused to respond. My lips parted, but no sound came out. I was trapped. The breathing grew heavier, closer. I could feel the warmth of it just inches from my skin. My chest tightened, panic rising in my throat. I tried to scream. Then, it stopped. The weight lifted, and suddenly I could move again. I rolled over, gasping for air, my hands clutching at the blankets. Joe stirred. "You okay?" I could barely find my voice. "Yeah, just a nightmare." But it wasn't a nightmare. It happened, again the next night, and the next. Each time the feeling lasted a little longer. Each time the breathing got closer. And then one night, I finally saw it. It was past midnight. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of the old wood settling. I lay in bed, wide awake, waiting, dreading, the feeling that I knew would come. Then, across the room, near the closet door, a shadow moved. At first I thought it was just the darkness playing tricks on me. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw a tall, thin figure standing just beyond the reach of the dim streetlight filtering through the curtains, watching me. It didn't move. It didn't breathe. It just stood there. A cold, suffocating dread filled my chest. My heart pounded so loud I was sure it would wake Joe. But he didn't stir. And neither did the thing in the corner. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just stared, waiting, praying for it to disappear. Then, without a sound, it took a step forward. I did the only thing I could. I squeezed my eyes shut and whispered, "Please, go away." The room was silent. For a long, agonizing moment, I thought it was over. Then, a whisper, so close to my ear I felt the breath on my skin. "I'm not going anywhere," I screamed. The lights flicked on. Joe shot up beside me. "Mary, what the hell?" I gasped for air, my hands shaking as I pointed toward the closet. There was someone. Joe turned, his eyes scanning. The room. The closet door was slightly open, revealing nothing but darkness inside. "There's nothing there," he said, his voice groggy, annoyed. But I knew better. Something was in this house, and it wasn't leaving. After that night, I stopped sleeping. I tried, I really did. But every time I closed my eyes, I expected to hear it. The whisper, the breathing, the weight pressing me down. The moment I drifted off, I'd wake up gasping, heart racing, eyes darting toward the closet. I knew what I saw. I knew it had been real. But Joe didn't believe me. "It was just a nightmare," he kept saying. "You were half asleep. Your mind was playing tricks on you." I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to believe him, but deep down I knew he was wrong, and then things got worse. One night I put Charlie and Mary to bed and stayed up reading in the living room, too afraid to go upstairs. The old clock on the wall ticked steadily, and for the first time in weeks, I felt calm. Then, around midnight, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from upstairs. I froze. Joe was working late that night and both kids were asleep. So who was walking around? I placed my book down and stood up, every muscle tense. The floorboards above me creaked. Someone was moving. I grabbed the fireplace poker, my hands slick with sweat. I wasn't about to wait for whatever it was to come to me. I climbed the stairs, heart pounding, gripping the iron handle so tight my fingers ached. At the top, I paused. The hallway was dark. Too dark. I could just barely make out Charlie's door to the right, slightly ajar, his nightlight casting a faint glow on the carpet. Mary's room was on the left. Her door was closed. But the closet door at the end of the hall, it was wide open. Cold shiver ran down my spine. I took a slow, shaky breath and stepped forward. "Charlie," I whispered. "Mary?" No answer. The air felt heavy, thick, like the entire house was holding its breath. I stepped closer to the closet. The door creaked slightly as I moved, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife. Then, from the darkness inside the closet, I heard it. A low, raspy breath, right in front of me. I choked on a gasp and stumbled backward, the fireplace, poker slipping from my grasp. My knees buckled, but I caught myself on the doorframe, my mind screaming at me to run. Then a hand shot out. It grabbed my wrist, ice-cold fingers too long, too thin. I screamed. I ripped my arm away and bolted down the hall, shoving Charlie's door open. He jolted awake, eyes wide with confusion. "Mom," he mumbled sleepily. I slammed the door shut and locked it, pressing my back against it, my chest heaving. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, coming down the hall. Charlie sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Mom, what's wrong?" I couldn't answer. I was too busy listening. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. A long silence stretched between us, then the doorknob turned. I bit my lip so hard I tasted blood. The knob rattled once, then stopped. Another pause. Then a whisper from the other side of the door. "You can't hide forever." I squeezed, my eyes shut, willing it to be a dream. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the presence was gone. The hallway fell silent. Charlie whimpered, "Mom, I'm scared." I pulled him into my arms, holding him tight. "It's okay, baby," I whispered. "It's okay." But I knew it wasn't. Not even close. Because whatever lived in this house wanted me. And it wasn't stopping. I didn't sleep. Not that night, not the night after. I stayed awake, curled up in Charlie's bed with him, listening to every creak, every whisper of wind against the window. My entire body was on high alert, waiting for something, anything to happen again. But it didn't. Not right away. The house was quiet for the next few days, but the silence wasn't comforting. It was the kind of quiet that presses against your ears, that makes you feel like you're being watched even when no one's there. And then, the final night came. Joe was working late again. Charlie and Mary were fast asleep. I had finally convinced myself to go back to my own bed, but I left the lamp on, too afraid to be in the dark. That's when the smell hit me. Rot, dampness, something decaying. I gagged, covering my nose. The air grew thick, heavy with the stench. It was coming from the closet. I knew what I had to do. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, the beam shaking as I pointed it toward the closet door. My entire body was trembling, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I took a step forward, then another. My fingers brushed the doorknob, and that's when the door slammed open. I screamed, stumbling backward, but the light from my phone cut through the darkness and I saw it. A figure, tall, gaunt, its skin stretched too tightly over its bones. Black, hollow eyes, a grin that stretched unnaturally wide. It was hunched, long fingers curling against the inside of the closet door, watching me, waiting. It took a step forward. I ran. I didn't stop to think, didn't stop to breathe. I grabbed Charlie and Mary, barely giving them time to wake up before dragging them down the stairs. The house felt alive. The walls groaned, the air crackled, the lights flickered violently. As I reached the front door, I heard it, heavy footsteps pounding down the stairs behind me. I didn't look back. I threw open the door, shoved my kids outside and slammed it shut behind me. Then, silence. The house went still. I stood on the front lawn, clutching Charlie and Mary, my heart slamming against my ribs. The windows were dark. The front door didn't move. It was like nothing had happened. But I knew better. We never went back. The next morning, I called Joe and told him we were leaving. We packed whatever we could fit in the car and drove straight to my sister's place across town. I didn't care about breaking the lease. I didn't care about the money we'd spent fixing the place up. I just wanted to be gone. A few months later, I heard the house had been abandoned again. No one stayed long. People moved in, then left, within weeks, saying it didn't feel right. I never told them what I saw. Some things aren't meant to be explained. Some houses aren't just old. Some shadows aren't just tricks of the light. And when your gut tells you something isn't right, listen. The first time it happened, I was 16. I had fallen asleep early, exhausted from school and the weight of teenage life. But my dreams weren't the usual scattered nonsense. That night I saw my grandfather. He stood at the foot of my bed, his face illuminated by a soft, unnatural glow. His eyes filled with something between sorrow and urgency, locked onto mine. "It's your mother," he said. His voice was calm, but there was a heaviness to it. "Her lungs. She needs help." I jolted awake, my heart racing. My grandfather had been dead for 3 years. It wasn't real, I told myself. Just a dream. But the feeling wouldn't leave me. I mentioned it to Mom at breakfast, laughing it off, but she looked at me strangely. "That's weird," she said, rubbing her chest. "I have been feeling a little off lately." 2 weeks later, she collapsed in the kitchen. By the time the paramedics arrived, she was struggling to breathe. Pneumonia, they said. A serious infection. Her lungs were failing. Then, as if that wasn't enough, her heart followed. I sat by her hospital bed for days, replaying my grandfather's words. If I had pushed her to see a doctor sooner, would it have changed anything? I never told anyone about the dream, but deep down I knew. My grandfather had warned me, and I was almost too late to listen. Years passed and the dream stopped, or maybe I stopped paying attention. Then my daughter was born. The first night home from the hospital, exhaustion pulled me into a deep sleep. And there he was again, Grandpa. This time, he wasn't warning me. He was smiling. "She's beautiful," he said. "You have nothing to fear." I woke up in tears. I hadn't thought about him in so long, but now, in the quiet of my darkened room, his presence still lingered. The dream felt more real than any I had ever had. The next morning, I found something strange. On the dresser beside my daughter's crib was an old photo of my grandfather, the same one we had displayed at his funeral. I hadn't put it there. No one had. I picked it up, tracing the edges with my fingers. My hands were shaking. Somewhere in the depths of my gut, I knew the truth. He had been here, and somehow, even from beyond, he was still watching over us. A year later, another dream came. But this time, it wasn't my grandfather. It was David, a childhood friend, one I hadn't spoken to in years. He stood in a dimly lit hallway, his face blank. "I just wanted to say goodbye," he said softly. "I thought you should know." Then he turned and walked into the darkness. I woke up with a start, cold sweat dripping down my spine. My chest felt heavy, like something unseen was pressing against it. The next morning, I checked my phone. My hands trembled as I scrolled through my messages. A missed call from an old friend, a text that simply read, "David died last night." The air in the room seemed to still. I sat there for a long time, staring at the screen, the words blurring together. He had come to say goodbye, and I had heard him. Not all of them were welcome visitors. A few years after David's visit, I had another dream. This one made my stomach churn. It was my ex, the one who had hurt me in ways I never spoke about, the one who left bruises and scars that no one could see. He stood in a place I didn't recognize, a vast nothingness that stretched forever. His face was pale, his eyes sunken. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "for everything." I woke up, gasping, bile rising in my throat. I wanted to forget. I wanted to erase his voice from my head. But the next day I got a message from a mutual acquaintance. "He's dead," they said. "Car accident." I didn't respond. I didn't know how. Could the dead feel guilt? Did they seek forgiveness even when they never deserved it? I never dreamed of him again, and I never wanted to. The last dream, the one that still haunts me, was about Larry. Larry had been my cousin's brother. I didn't know him well, but I knew his story, his sudden death, the grief it left behind. One night he appeared in my dream. "I need you to tell her," he said. "Tell who?" I asked, confused. He sighed, looking past me like he could see something I couldn't. "My sister. Just tell her I'm okay." I hesitated. Then I woke up. I debated saying nothing. It wasn't my place. But the feeling wouldn't leave me, that nagging weight in my chest. So I did. I told my cousin about the dream, bracing for her to call me crazy. Instead, she started crying. "I've been asking for a sign," she whispered. "I just wanted to know if he was okay." I never dreamed of Larry again, but I think that's because I didn't need to. He had his message delivered, and finally he could rest. The night my grandmother died, the house felt different. It wasn't just the grief that hung over us like a thick fog. It was something else. Something wrong. The air felt heavy, pressing down on my chest with an invisible weight. Even the familiar creaks of the old wooden floors seemed louder, more deliberate, like the house itself was aware of her absence. After the funeral, my family gathered at my grandfather's house. It was the same house where my grandmother had spent the last 40 years of her life, the house where she had raised her children and eventually where she had taken her last breath. My mother and aunts moved through the rooms quietly, tidying up, picking up empty coffee cups, folding blankets that no one had used. My grandfather sat in his chair by the fireplace, staring at nothing, his hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles had turned white. I sat on the couch feeling restless, my gaze drawn to the hallway that led to her bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, just enough to show the darkness beyond. A chill crawled up my spine, though the room was warm from the fire. Then, the door creaked. I held my breath. It wasn't the usual groaning sound of old hinges shifting from a draft. This was slower, deliberate, like someone on the other side was pushing it open. I turned to my mother, expecting her to have noticed, but she was focused on folding a dish towel. My aunt kept talking, her voice low and tired. No one else seemed to hear it. I looked back at the hallway. The door was open wider now. That night, my aunt chose to sleep in my grandmother's old room. She had always been the closest to her, and I think she found comfort in being near her things. The floral quilt, the little porcelain angel figurines lined up on the dresser, the faint, lingering scent of her perfume. She didn't find comfort for long. Sometime after midnight, a scream tore through the house. I bolted upright in bed, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the hall. My mother ran past my door. I scrambled out of bed and followed, my stomach twisting. My aunt was sitting up in bed, pale as a sheet, her hand gripping her wrist. "She grabbed me," she whispered, her voice shaking. "She grabbed me." I stepped closer. A red mark wrapped around her wrist like the imprint of fingers. The air in the room was ice cold. My grandfather appeared in the doorway, his face unreadable. For a long moment, he just stared at my aunt's wrist. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away. Later, I saw him standing outside my grandmother's bedroom. His shoulders sagged and his lips moved as if he were whispering to someone. "Clara," he said softly, "I know you're still here." The door creaked open again, and this time, I knew I wasn't imagining it. After that night, nothing felt normal in my grandfather's house. It wasn't just the grief settling into the walls, it was something else. Something unseen, lingering in the empty spaces Grandma used to fill. My mother and aunts tried to dismiss it as our imaginations, running wild, but I knew better. So did Grandpa. I started noticing how he avoided certain rooms, how he always made sure his bedroom door was locked at night. He had never been a fearful man. Years of hard work and loss had made him tough, but now he was different, quieter, like he was waiting for something. One evening I found him sitting on the porch staring out into the trees. The sky was dark and the air was heavy with the scent of rain. I hesitated before stepping outside, drawn to the way his hands trembled against the arms of his chair. "Grandpa?" He didn't turn to look at me, he just kept staring. "She came last night," he said finally. A cold knot twisted in my stomach. I didn't ask who. I already knew. "She was standing at the foot of my bed," he continued, his voice distant. "She looked just like she did before she passed. She didn't say anything, just watched me." A shiver ran down my spine. "I thought it was a dream," he said. Until Duke started barking. My breath caught in my throat. Duke had been dead for 5 years. Grandpa turned to me then, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. "I saw him too," he whispered, sitting beside her, just like he used to. I didn't know what to say. That night I barely slept. Every sound in the house felt amplified. The groan of the old pipes, the wind rattling the windows, the slow creak of the wooden floorboards. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard it. Scratching. It was faint at first, like fingernails dragging against wood. It came from the hallway, from the direction of my grandmother's room. I pulled the covers up to my chin, straining to listen. The scratching grew louder, more deliberate. Then the door to my room creaked open. I froze. The hallway was dark, but in the faint glow of the nightlight from down the hall I saw it. A shadow, standing just outside my doorway. It was tall, motionless, watching. My chest tightened. My body felt paralyzed, unable to move, unable to breathe. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The air in my room grew lighter, the weight in my chest easing, but the fear didn't leave me. I forced myself to close my eyes, willing sleep to take me. And just as I started to drift off, I heard it again. The slow, steady creak of my grandmother's rocking chair, moving by itself. My mother never liked talking about ghosts. She was the kind of person who believed in logic, in science, in things she could explain. But one night, after too much wine and an evening of reminiscing about Grandma, she finally told me her story. I was a baby when it happened. My grandmother had only been gone for a few months, and grief hung over the family like a heavy fog. My mother was struggling, raising me, mourning her mother, and adjusting to a life without the person she had always turned to for guidance. Then one night she woke up to the sound of humming. At first she thought it was the baby monitor picking up a stray radio signal, but as she blinked the sleep from her eyes, she realized the sound was coming from down the hall. From my nursery, she sat up, her body rigid with unease. The humming was soft, almost melodic, like a lullaby. A song she hadn't heard in a long time. A song my grandmother used to sing to her when she was a child. Panic gripped her as she threw off the covers and ran down the hall. The door to my room was slightly open, a dim glow spilling into the hallway. She hesitated, her pulse hammering in her ears. Then she stepped inside. The room was filled with a strange light, not from the nightlight plugged into the wall, but from something else. It bathed the rocking chair in the corner, illuminating the figure seated there. My grandmother. She was holding me. I was cradled in her arms, wrapped in the same blanket she had knitted for me before she passed. She rocked slowly, her lips moving as she continued to hum the lullaby. For a long moment, my mother couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The sight of her mother, so solid, so real, froze her in place. Then, as if sensing her presence, my grandmother looked up and smiled. My mother let out a small gasp, and in an instant, the glow vanished. The room went dark. The rocking chair was empty. I lay in my crib, fast asleep, the blanket neatly tucked around me. The only sound was the faint creak of the chair as it swayed to a stop. She rushed over, lifting me into her arms, feeling my tiny chest rise and fall in steady breaths. Nothing was out of place. Nothing was wrong. Except for one thing. I was humming the same lullaby. The next morning, my mother packed up the rocking chair and stored it in the attic. She never spoke of that night again, until now. She looked at me across the table, her fingers tightening around the stem of her wine glass. She was there, she whispered. I know what I saw. I believed her, because later that night as I lay in bed, I heard it too. A soft, distant humming, coming from the attic. My uncle never believed in ghosts. He laughed at my grandfather's stories, dismissed my aunt's fears, and told my mother she was just dreaming when she spoke about Grandma rocking me to sleep. He was the logical one in the family, the skeptic, until the night he saw her. It was late, nearly midnight, and he was driving home from work on a 2-lane road just outside town. It was the kind of road that felt endless at night, surrounded by thick trees, no streetlights, and barely any traffic. The only sound was the steady hum of his tires against the asphalt and the occasional patter of rain on the windshield. Then the fog rolled in, thick and white, swallowing the road ahead. His high beams barely cut through it, making the drive even more unnerving. He slowed down, gripping the wheel tightly, his heart beginning to race. That's when he saw her. A woman standing at the edge of the road, dressed in a long, pale dress. Her silver hair cascaded down her back, slightly damp from the mist. She didn't move, didn't react to his headlights flooding over her. She just stood there, watching him. He slammed his foot on the brake, his truck skidding slightly before coming to a stop just a few feet from where she stood. His breath came in short gasps as he stared at her through the windshield. She lifted her hand, not a wave, not a plea for help. Just a slow, deliberate movement, palm facing him. A silent warning. A chill crawled up his spine. The temperature inside the truck plummeted, and for the first time in his life he felt true, paralyzing fear. Then he saw the tree. A massive oak had fallen across the road just past where the woman stood. If he hadn't stopped when he did, he would have crashed straight into it. He turned back to look at her, ready to roll down his window, to ask if she was real, if she needed help. But she was gone, vanished into the fog. His hands were shaking as he put the truck in reverse, turning around and taking the long way home. When he arrived, he sat in his driveway for nearly 10 minutes, gripping the steering wheel, trying to convince himself it had been a trick of the light, his tired mind playing games with him. But deep down, he knew the truth. The next morning, he called my mother. His voice was different, shaken in a way I had never heard before. "I swear it was her," he whispered. "It was Mom." My mother didn't argue. She didn't laugh or try to reason with him, because she knew. Grandma had saved him, just like she had never really left. I had always believed the stories. I had listened to my grandfather, my mother, my aunt, and even my uncle, each of them carrying an experience that convinced them Grandma had never truly left. But belief is different from experience. Until the night she saved me. It was late, past midnight, and I was driving home from a friend's house. The roads were quiet, empty except for my headlights cutting through the darkness. I wasn't tired, but there was a strange heaviness in the air, like the world was holding its breath. As I approached an intersection, something flickered in my peripheral vision. A figure on the side of the road. A woman. She stood just beyond the reach of my headlights, her long silver hair illuminated by the soft glow of a nearby street lamp. She was wearing a pale dress, almost the same one my uncle had described. My foot hesitated on the gas pedal. Then she lifted her hand. A slow, deliberate motion, just like before. My heart pounded. Something inside me screamed to listen. To stop. I slammed the brakes. At that exact moment, a truck barreled through the intersection, running the red light at full speed. It blew past me in a blur of metal and wind, missing the front of my car by inches. If I hadn't stopped, I would have been in its path. Shaking, I turned my head back to the woman. But she was gone. Only the empty road remained. The only thing left behind was the faint scent of lavender, my grandmother's perfume. I sat there, gripping the wheel, unable to move. My mind raced, trying to convince me that it was just exhaustion, a coincidence. But I knew better. She had saved me, just like she had saved my uncle, just like she had never really left. I pulled into my driveway minutes later, still shaken. As I turned off the engine, I sat in silence, listening to the world outside. The night was still, but something felt different, lighter, as if a weight I hadn't even known I was carrying had been lifted. That night I barely slept. My mind replayed the moment over and over, my grandmother's silent warning, the truck that could have ended my life. Then, just as I started to drift off, something stirred in my room. The air shifted, carrying the soft scent of lavender once more. And in the corner of the room where the shadows met the moonlight, I saw it. The faint outline of a figure. She didn't speak, she didn't move. But somehow I knew. She was watching over me. She always had, then, and she always would. Hospitals have always unsettled me. The sterile scent of antiseptic, the cold artificial lights, the quiet hum of machines keeping people alive. The air is thick with something more than grief, something unseen, something waiting. The night of my sister's brain surgery, the waiting room felt suffocating. Hours stretched into eternity, and the quiet conversations of other families blurred into white noise. I couldn't sit still. My fingers trembled as I scrolled through my phone, not reading anything, just pretending to be busy while dread settled into my bones. Then finally, a nurse called my name. "She's stable," she said. "You can see her now." Relief washed over me, but the weight in my chest didn't fully lift. As I stood, my legs felt weak, like I'd been holding my breath for too long. I followed the nurse down the hallway, past the endless rows of doors and the muffled sounds of machines beeping. Then, just as we reached the ICU doors, it happened. A hand covered mine, warm, steady, familiar. I stopped walking, my breath catching in my throat. My heart pounded. It felt so real, so solid, like someone was right beside me. I turned sharply, expecting to see my mother or another family member, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty. The nurse glanced at me, raising an eyebrow. "Are you okay?" I swallowed hard and nodded, forcing my feet to move again. But the sensation didn't fade. Even as I pushed through the ICU doors, my palm still tingled as if the hand had just released me. When I stepped into my sister's room, the beeping of the machines seemed deafening. She lay still, her head wrapped in white gauze, her face pale. The sight of her like that made my stomach turn. I pulled a chair closer to her bed and reached for her hand. But just before my fingers touched hers, I felt it again. The warmth, not from my sister, from something standing right behind me. I stiffened, every hair on my body rising. The air turned cold in an instant, the warmth vanishing as if whatever had been there had just stepped away. The door to the room creaked, softly. I turned quickly, expecting to see a nurse or a doctor, but there was no one, just the empty hallway stretching out beyond the door. I sat there for hours, unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone, had guided me here. Later that night, when my mother arrived, she placed a hand on my shoulder. "I had the strangest feeling earlier," she murmured, like Mom was with me. A chill ran down my spine, because I knew. I had felt it too. The night before we found out my niece had cystic fibrosis, my grandmother knocked on the door. I know how that sounds. She had been gone for years, buried in the same cemetery where generations of our family lay. But I know what I heard. It was late, just after midnight. I was in the kitchen rinsing out my coffee mug, my mind heavy with exhaustion. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the old wall clock. Everyone else was asleep. Then came the knock. 3 slow, deliberate knocks against the front door. I froze, the warm water running over my hands forgotten. My stomach twisted. It wasn't the kind of knock someone makes when they're just stopping by. It was slow, too precise. I turned off the faucet and wiped my hands, moving cautiously toward the door. The hairs on my arms stood on end. I hesitated, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it. Through the peephole, the porch was empty. I swallowed hard. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe I was just exhausted. Then the knocks came again. Louder this time. I sucked in a breath and yanked the door open, expecting to see someone standing there. No one. The porch light flickered for a moment. before going out, leaving me in the dim glow of the street lamp outside. A cold breeze rushed past me, carrying the scent of lavender, my grandmother's perfume. I slammed the door shut and locked it, pressing my back against the wood. My pulse thundered in my ears. I wanted to believe it was the wind, the house settling, anything rational. But deep down, I knew. The next morning, my sister called. Her voice was strained, her words tumbling out too fast. "It's about Lucy," she said, barely above a whisper. They found something. Cystic fibrosis." A cold shiver ran through me. I barely heard the rest of what she said. My mind was stuck on the night before, the knocks, the perfume. Grandma had been here. She had tried to tell me. That evening, I sat on the couch, staring at the front door, waiting for another sign. At exactly midnight, the door creaked softly. No knocks this time, just the faintest whisper of movement. And the scent of lavender. I was 12 when Charlie saved my life. Charlie wasn't a person, he was our golden retriever, the best dog we ever had. Loyal, gentle, and always by my side. He had died 2 years before, but sometimes late at night, I still heard him. The soft click of his nails on the hardwood floor, the jingle of his collar. My mother always told me it was just the house settling. But I knew better. The night it happened, I had gone to bed feeling off. It wasn't a sickness, not really. Just a strange heaviness in my chest. My limbs felt weak, my eyelids heavy. I assumed I was just overtired. At some point, I drifted into sleep. Then I stopped breathing. I don't remember it the way people talk about near-death experiences. There was no tunnel of light, no out-of-body sensation, just darkness. An overwhelming, suffocating darkness, like something heavy was pressing down on my chest. I couldn't move. I couldn't wake up. Then I heard barking. It was loud, frantic, desperate. Charlie. His bark had always been distinct, deep and commanding. But this was different, urgent. I tried to wake up, but my body wouldn't respond. The pressure on my chest grew worse, like invisible hands were pushing me down into the bed. My lungs burned. My heart pounded wildly in my ears. The barking got louder, closer. Then, all at once, the pressure lifted. I gasped, my body jerking upright as air rushed into my lungs. My vision swam, my limbs tingling as if I had been holding my breath for hours. I sat there, dazed, my hands shaking. My bedroom door was open. It had been closed when I went to sleep. The hallway was dark, but in the faint glow from the bathroom nightlight, I saw something move, a golden blur just outside my doorway. I bolted out of bed, my heart hammering as I stumbled into the hall. My breath came in ragged gasps as I scanned the empty space. "Charlie?" My voice was barely a whisper. Nothing. But the scent of dog, warm fur, and the faint, familiar musk of his old bed still lingered in the air. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. I knew what had happened. I had stopped breathing, and Charlie, wherever he was, had come back to wake me up. I never told my mother, I never told anyone. But after that night, I stopped questioning what I heard in the house, because Charlie was still here, and he wasn't going anywhere. The night the photo fell, the house was quiet. Too quiet. Lucy was playing on the floor, her small hands moving plastic figurines across the carpet, lost in her own little world. I sat nearby, scrolling through my phone, half listening to the hum of the television in the background. It was a normal evening, peaceful in the way that only late nights could be. Then the crash shattered the silence. I jumped, my heart slamming against my ribs. The framed photo of my cousin Adam had fallen from the shelf. I stared at it, my pulse hammering in my ears. That picture had been sitting on the same shelf for years, untouched. There was no breeze, no vibration, nothing that could have caused it to fall. Lucy looked up from her toys. She didn't flinch, didn't seem surprised. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. Then she whispered, "Adam's upset." A chill crawled up my spine. I swallowed hard. Why do you say that, sweetheart? She blinked up at me, her face eerily calm. He said to be careful. The room felt colder, the air thicker, pressing down on me like an unseen force. My throat tightened as I picked up the fallen photo, brushing dust from the glass. Adam had died years ago in a car accident, his loss still a raw wound in the family. Lucy, I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. Did Adam talk to you? She nodded once, absently moving her toy figures again. He said something bad is coming. My stomach twisted. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound in the house felt amplified. The distant creak of the floorboards, the occasional hum of the refrigerator, the wind rattling against the windows. I kept staring at the photo of Adam, now back in its place on the shelf, as if expecting it to move again. The next morning my phone rang. My hands trembled as I answered. It was my mother. She was crying. "It's your brother," she sobbed. "He was in a car accident last night." My blood ran cold. "Is he okay?" I managed to choke out. "He's fine. Not even a scratch," she said. "But his car is totaled. The police said it was a miracle he survived." I couldn't breathe. Lucy's words echoed in my mind. He said to be careful. Adam had warned us, and he had saved my brother's life. The older I got, the more I realized the dead never really leave us. They find ways to stay, in whispers that slip through an empty room, in the flicker of a light that shouldn't be on, in the sudden warmth of a hand when no one is there. After Adam's warning, after Lucy's eerie words, I knew I had to stop ignoring the signs. Our family was never alone. We never had been. But the night I truly understood was the night of the knocks. It was late, past midnight, and the house was silent. I sat alone in the dim glow of the living room lamp, staring at the old framed photo of my grandmother on the mantel. My mind raced with everything that had happened. Charlie's warning, Adam's message, my sister's surgery. Then I heard it. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. They came from inside the house. I sat frozen, every hair on my body standing on end. The sound had come from the hallway, the same hallway that led to my bedroom. I turned my head slowly, my breath shallow. The hallway was dark, a long stretch of shadows swallowing the faint moonlight. Then the air shifted. The scent of lavender drifted through the room, soft, familiar, my grandmother's perfume. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I didn't move, didn't breathe. My hands trembled as I gripped the arms of the chair. I knew, if I stood up, if I followed the scent, I would see her. I didn't want to see her. The air grew colder, pressing against me, wrapping around my shoulders like invisible hands. I squeezed my eyes shut, my heart pounding so hard it echoed in my ears. Then, just as suddenly as it came, the feeling lifted. The scent faded. The air warmed. The house was silent again. I exhaled shakily, forcing myself to stand. My legs were weak, my body buzzing with adrenaline. I took slow, cautious steps toward the hallway, my fingers grazing the wall for balance. Then I stopped. The picture of my grandmother had fallen from the mantel, face down. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, I bent down and picked it up, my hands trembling as I turned it over. The glass was unbroken. The photo was untouched. But I understood. She had been here. They all had. Watching. Protecting. Waiting. I placed the photo back on the mantel, my chest tight, with something between fear and comfort. My hands still shook, but deep inside I knew the truth. I would never be alone. None of us ever were. Daniel, my husband, worked long hours in the city. We had moved to this town because it was cheaper, a place where we could afford a home big enough for our growing family. He visited on weekends, but most nights it was just me, our 5-year-old son Liam, and our baby Noah. The house was old, a creaking Victorian with too many rooms and a basement I hadn't dared to explore yet. The real estate agent had called it charming and historic. I should have heard the warning in those words. The moment we moved in, I noticed small things, shadows shifting in the corner of my eye, the air in certain rooms too cold despite the summer heat, the feeling of being watched. Then came the crying. It started on our third night. A soft, muffled weeping. At first I thought it was Noah. I rushed to his crib, my heart pounding, but he was fast asleep, his tiny chest rising and falling peacefully. I stood there, confused. The sound was still there, faint but undeniable. Then I realized it wasn't coming from the nursery, it was coming from below. My stomach clenched as I turned toward the hallway. The basement door stood at the end, a heavy wooden thing with an old iron handle. I hadn't even tried to open it since we moved in. I told myself it was just the old pipes, the house settling, the wind. Anything but what it sounded like. A woman crying in the dark. The next morning I tried to push the thought away. Liam was already up playing with his toy cars in the living room. He looked up at me, his bright blue eyes filled with excitement. "Mommy, I heard the lady last night," he said casually. My breath caught. "What lady?" He pointed toward the basement door. "She was crying." I forced a smile. "Sweetheart, you must have been dreaming." Liam just shrugged and went back to playing. But my skin prickled. He had heard it too. I needed to talk to someone. That afternoon, while Liam napped and Noah cooed in his crib, I stepped outside for some air. That's when I met James. He was fixing the fence along his property, his sleeves rolled up, revealing strong forearms. He glanced up, smiled. "Hey, new neighbor." I smiled back, grateful for the distraction. "Hi, I'm Claire." "James," he said, wiping his hands. "Settling in okay?" I hesitated, then blurted out, "Does this house have a history?" James's smile faded slightly. He leaned on the fence, studying me. "Why do you ask?" I debated telling him. It sounded crazy, but something in his expression made me trust him. "I keep crying," I admitted, "at night, from the basement." James's jaw tightened. He glanced at the house, then back at me. "Old houses make noises," he said, but there was something forced in his tone. I crossed my arms. "You don't believe that?" He exhaled. "Look, Claire, people talk. This town has its stories, but if I were you, I'd keep that basement locked." A chill ran through me. That night, I locked the basement door. I double-checked it before putting the boys to bed. I even placed a chair against it just to be sure. But at 2:47 a.m., I woke to a sound that turned my blood to ice, the soft, sorrowful crying, and the creak of a door opening. I sat up, my breath hitching. I turned toward the hallway. The basement door was open. I haven't slept properly in days. Since moving into this house, something has felt off. It's not just the crying at night or the eerie cold spots that linger no matter how high I turn up the heat. It's the way I feel when I'm alone, as if someone is watching me from just beyond my sight. I tell myself it's all in my head, that being alone with 2 kids in a big unfamiliar house is playing tricks on me. But the open basement door last night shattered that illusion. It was locked. I remember locking it. I had wedged a chair against it before bed, double-checking the deadbolt, ensuring there was no way it could open on its own. And yet, when I woke up to the sound of weeping at nearly 3 in the morning, the door was standing wide open. The crying had stopped. The air was thick, heavy, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Noah stirred in his crib, letting out a soft whimpering sound. I rushed to him, checking his tiny body, making sure he was okay. He was warm, safe, sleeping. Then a whisper, right behind me. "Claire." I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs, but there was nothing. Just the open basement door and the darkness beyond it. I wanted to wake Liam, to grab both boys and run to the neighbor's house. But something told me I couldn't leave. That if I left the door open, something would come up. So step by step, I approached it. The air grew colder with each movement, my breath coming out in quick, shallow gasps. I reached the door frame, my fingers trembling as I grabbed the knob, The darkness inside the basement seemed to pulse like it was alive, waiting. I slammed the door shut, locked it. Then, I shoved the chair back against it, my whole body shaking. I barely slept after that. Every creak of the house made me jump. Every time Noah stirred, I held him tighter. My body was tense, exhausted, but my mind was wide awake. Morning couldn't come fast enough. The next day, I tried to shake it off. I made pancakes for Liam, kissed Noah's chubby little cheeks, and opened the windows to let in sunlight. Normal things. Things to remind myself that I wasn't crazy. Liam was playing on the floor, driving his toy truck back and forth, when he suddenly looked up at me. "Mommy," he said, tilting his head. "She sad?" I froze. "Who's sad, baby?" He pointed toward the basement door. "The lady downstairs. She said she lost her baby." My stomach turned. My skin prickled with ice. I swallowed, forcing a shaky smile. "That's just pretend, sweetheart." Liam frowned. "No, she talks to me. She said she misses him." I felt sick. I needed answers. I found myself at James's house before I even realized I had walked there. My hands shook as I knocked on his door. He opened it, looking surprised to see me. "Claire?" I glanced over my shoulder, as if the house could hear me. "Can I come in?" James stepped aside, concern shadowing his face. I barely waited for him to close the door before I blurted out, "Tell me the truth about my house." He sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "I told you." "No," I cut him off. "No more vague warnings. No more old houses make noises." I woke up last night and the basement door was open. "I locked it, James." My voice cracked. "Liam says there's a woman down there, that she talks to him, that she's looking for her baby." James's expression darkened. He rubbed the back of his neck, then finally met my gaze. "There's a reason no one in this town wanted that house," he admitted. "Years ago, a woman named Margaret lived there. Her husband left her and she lost herself. She had a baby, but one night something happened. I could barely breathe." "What happened?" James hesitated. Then he said the words that sent ice through my veins. "She drowned him." I clutched my stomach, my knees weakening. "No." He nodded grimly. "In the basement, in the old well. She couldn't handle the guilt. He stopped himself, watching my face. "She killed herself," I whispered. James nodded. I swallowed hard. "Then why is she still here?" James exhaled sharply. "Because she's looking for him. And now, you have a baby in that house." A chill wrapped around me like a noose. Something deep inside me whispered that this wasn't just a story, that Margaret was still there, and that she thought Noah was hers. I never considered myself a religious person. Growing up, my parents took me to church on holidays, but faith was never something I held on to. Life had a way of making me believe that prayers went unanswered, that ghosts were just stories, that the dead stayed buried. But after what happened last night, I wasn't so sure anymore. James's words haunted me. "Because she's looking for him. And now, you have a baby in that house." That night, I barely slept. Every sound made my skin crawl. The house felt colder, darker, like the walls were listening. I cradled Noah close, my body curled around him like a shield. Liam thankfully slept soundly in his bed. But I couldn't stop replaying what he had said. "The lady downstairs, she said she lost her baby." It wasn't my imagination. It wasn't just the house settling. There was something in my home, something that my son wanted. By morning, I knew I had to do something, and there was only one place I could think to go. The church stood at the edge of town, small and weathered, its steeple casting long shadows against the gray sky. It had been abandoned for years, but someone still looked after it. Father Thomas. He was old, his face lined with time, his eyes deep wells of knowing. He still lived in the rectory beside the church, tending to the graveyard, keeping the doors open for lost souls like me. I found him kneeling near the altar, the scent of candle wax thick in the air. He looked up as I entered, his expression calm but unreadable. "You look troubled, my child," he said, his voice raspy yet kind. I swallowed, the lump in my throat. "It's my house," I whispered. Something isn't right." His gaze sharpened. He gestured for me to sit. "Tell me." And so I did. I told him everything. The crying in the basement, the open door, Liam's eerie words, James's warning, the way the house seemed to breathe at night. Father Thomas listened, his hands clasped, nodding slowly. When I finished, he exhaled deeply as if he had been expecting this. "You live in the Montgomery house, don't you?" The name sent a chill through me. "Yes," I murmured. His fingers traced the edge of the wooden pew, lost in thought. "Many years ago, a woman named Margaret lived there. She was a devoted wife, until her husband abandoned her. The grief consumed her. She had an infant son, but in her despair, she did something unthinkable." I closed my eyes, already knowing what he would say. "She drowned him," he whispered. My stomach twisted. I wanted to stop him, to cover my ears, but I needed to hear it. "She threw herself into the well after, but she never moved on. Her soul is restless, trapped in the house where she took her child's life. And now..." He hesitated, his gaze locking onto mine. I gripped the pew. "Now what?" His voice dropped to a whisper. "Now she thinks your son is hers." A cold wave crashed over me. "No," I said, shaking my head. "No, that's not possible." Father Thomas sighed. "Spirits that linger do so for a reason. She's searching for the child she lost, and she won't stop until she gets him." I wanted to run, to grab my boys and leave the town, never look back, but something told me it wouldn't be that easy. "She's already in the house," I whispered. Father Thomas nodded. "She's attached to it, and if she's strong enough to make herself known, to open doors..." He trailed off, his expression grim. I finished the thought for him. "Then, she's strong enough to take him." He reached into his robe, pulling out a small vial of holy water and a silver cross. "You must bless your home. You must pray. And under no circumstances should you go into that basement." I swallowed hard, gripping the cross as if it would save me. "What if it's not enough?" His eyes darkened. "Then we'll have to force her out." I left the church with my heart pounding, my hands clutching the holy water like a lifeline. But deep down I knew Margaret wasn't going to leave without a fight, and I wasn't sure I was strong enough to stop her. I used to love the quiet. Before moving here, the sound of silence was a gift. In the city, life was chaos. Honking cars, distant sirens, the endless hum of people moving. But in this house, silence had become something else entirely. A presence, a waiting. And last night the silence had been broken by the sound of my son's crib creaking, by the whisper of my name, by the open basement door. It took every ounce of my strength to slam it shut, to lock it, to hold Noah against my chest and pretend that everything was okay. But I know the truth now. Father Thomas had confirmed it. Margaret Montgomery was real, and she wanted my baby. I barely made it through the morning without breaking down. Liam was his usual happy self, completely unaware of the horror creeping around us. He played with his cars, talked to his stuffed animals, giggled when Noah reached for his toys. But I watched him closely now. He spoke to someone at night. I had heard him whispering, laughing, answering questions I couldn't hear, and I was terrified to ask who. By noon, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed help. I found myself back at James's house, my hands shaking as I knocked on his door. He opened it almost immediately, as if he had been expecting me. His expression darkened when he saw my face. "She came again, didn't she?" I nodded. She opened the basement door. James clenched his jaw, stepping aside so I could enter. His house was different from mine, smaller, cozier, lived in. It smelled like wood and coffee, nothing like the stale air in my own home. I sat on his couch, gripping the silver cross Father Thomas had given me. James sat across from me, watching carefully. "Tell me everything," I told him. About the crying, about Liam's strange comments, about the way the house felt colder, heavier, as if something was pressing down on it, about last night when I found Noah's crib empty, only to see a shadow holding him, rocking him, whispering to him in the dark. James exhaled sharply. "She's getting stronger." I shook my head, my throat tightening. "Why? Why now?" James hesitated. Then finally he said, "Because you have what she lost." I swallowed hard. "The town never talks about her," James continued. "They act like she never existed. But my grandmother, she told me stories." I leaned forward. "What stories?" James rubbed his hands together as if trying to warm them. "Margaret wasn't just any woman. She was different. People in town said she practiced things, dark things. She was obsessed with death, with the afterlife. Some said she used to sit by the well for hours, whispering into it as if talking to someone who wasn't there." A chill crept up my spine. James lowered his voice. "The night she drowned her baby, she didn't act alone." I blinked. "What do you mean?" He hesitated. "People say something told her to do it. Something inside that house. That's good. They found her body days later, but her face..." He stopped himself, shaking his head. "What about her face?" I pressed. James exhaled. "It was twisted, like she had seen something before she died. Something horrible." I gripped my arms, feeling sick. "She never left that house," James said. "But I don't think it's just her. I think there's something worse down there. Something that made her do what she did." I shuddered, gripping the cross in my palm. "So what do I do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. James held my gaze. "You get out." Tears burned in my eyes. "I can't. My husband bought this house. It's our home." James leaned forward. "Claire, listen to me. She's not going to stop. You have a baby just like she did. She thinks Noah is hers." I shook my head, standing. "I can't just leave." James grabbed my hand before I could go. "Then you need to be ready," he said. "Because if you stay, she's coming. For him." That night I sat in Noah's room, holding him close, listening, waiting. And at exactly 2:47 a.m., the crying began again. Only this time, it was inside the house. I never should have stayed. Every instinct told me to run, to pack up my boys, and leave, to never look back. But this was our home. We had nowhere else to go. Daniel had spent our savings on this house, convinced it was the fresh start we needed. But I know now. This house wasn't ours. It never had been. It belonged to her. And tonight, she was coming for Noah. After leaving James's house, I did. The only thing I could think of. I called Father Thomas. He arrived just after dark, carrying a Bible, a vial of holy water, and a look of quiet determination. James came too, refusing to let me face this alone. As soon as Father Thomas stepped inside, he inhaled sharply. "She's strong," he murmured. "She knows we're here." A shiver ran down my spine. "What do we do?" He handed me the holy water. "We bless the house, we pray, and we don't let her take him." I nodded, holding Noah close. Liam clung to my leg, sensing my fear. We started in the living room. Father Thomas murmured prayers, sprinkling holy water along the walls. James moved to the windows, making sure they were locked. Every creak of the house sent my heart racing. When we reached the hallway, the air grew thick, suffocating, then a loud bang. The basement door rattled violently, as if something was throwing itself against it. Liam whimpered, burying his face in my leg. "She's here," Father Thomas whispered. The crying began again, louder this time, more desperate. My baby, please." The lights flickered, Shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls. The temperature dropped so suddenly that my breath came out in white clouds. Then, the worst sound of all, the basement door unlocked. I watched, frozen, in horror as the latch slid open on its own. The door creaked inch by inch, revealing nothing but pure blackness beyond. Then she stepped out. Margaret Montgomery. Her hair hung in wet, tangled strands over her face. Her dress was soaked, clinging to her thin, twisted frame. Her skin was pale and bloated, her eyes black pits of grief. And in her arms, she was rocking something. A bundle of cloth. A baby that wasn't there. I clutched Noah tighter, stepping back. Margaret lifted her head. Her lips quivered as she whispered, "You took him from me." "No," I choked out. "He's not yours." Her face twisted with rage. The crying turned into a wail, shrill and unnatural. The house shook. The windows shattered. Liam screamed. Then, before I could react, she lunged for Noah. I stumbled back, but something, an unseen force, ripped him from my arms. He floated toward her, tiny arms reaching as if entranced. I screamed, "Noah!" James grabbed me before I could run forward. Father Thomas raised his cross. "Margaret Montgomery, you have no claim to this child." His voice boomed through the house. "In the name of God, I command you to release him," Margaret shrieked, her body contorting unnaturally. But she wouldn't let go. I fell to my knees, praying. "Please," I sobbed. "Please don't take my baby." Margaret's head snapped toward me, her hollow eyes locked onto mine. For a moment, just a moment, I saw something there. Pain, guilt, regret. She looked down at Noah. Her grip faltered. And then, in a voice so broken, so full of sorrow, she whispered, "I only wanted to hold him one last time." Then, she faded. Noah dropped from the air. I lunged, catching him just before he hit the ground. He let out a soft, sleepy cry, curling into my chest. The house went silent. The cold lifted. She was gone. We left the next morning. I didn't even pack. I just strapped my boys into the car and drove. James followed us to the motel, making sure we were safe. I never set foot in that house again. Days later, I got a call from Daniel. He didn't believe me. Said I was overreacting, that I was stressed. I told him I didn't care. That house was never meant to be ours, because Margaret never left, and I wasn't going to stay long enough to find out if she would come back. I never planned to move back. After the divorce, I wanted nothing to do with this place. The house my father left me had too many memories, most of them bad. It was old, creaky, and smelled like dust and lost time. But after losing my job and struggling with alimony, I had no choice. It was just me and my son Ethan who stayed with me on weekends. He was 8, full of questions, and still adjusting to the idea that his parents would never get back together. "This house is creepy," he had said the first time I brought him over. "It's too quiet." I agreed, but I never said it out loud. The first few nights were uneventful. I worked late, unpacked, tried to keep my mind off the divorce. Ethan was with his mother that week, so the house was empty. Too empty. At night, I'd wake up to silence so thick it felt unnatural. The air was heavy, like something unseen was pressing down on the walls. Then, on the 4th night, I heard it. A small voice. "Dad?" I sat up in bed, heart hammering. My first thought was Ethan. I even checked my phone, but there were no missed calls, no texts. He wasn't here, and I only had one child. I tried to dismiss it. Maybe I had been dreaming. Maybe I was just exhausted. But the next night it happened again. I was brushing my teeth when I heard it, soft, hesitant. "Dad?" I nearly dropped my toothbrush. The voice was coming from the hallway. I stepped out, expecting to find Ethan, even though I knew he wasn't there. The hallway was empty, dimly lit by the nightlight I had plugged in for him. The air felt wrong, charged with something I couldn't explain. Then I heard footsteps. Small, bare, feet padding across the hardwood floor. I spun around. Nothing. I checked every room, turned on every light. The house was empty. But when I got back to my bedroom, the closet door was open, and I knew I hadn't touched it. The next day, I went up to the attic. If I was going crazy, I needed proof. My father had kept boxes of old family photos, things I had never bothered looking through. Dust coated the cardboard as I pried one open. Faded pictures spilled out, images of my dad, my grandparents, and then I found one that made my blood turn cold. A boy, maybe 6 or 7, standing in front of the house. He had dark hair, big eyes. He looked eerily familiar. I flipped it over. The back was labeled in my father's handwriting. Isaac, 1972. I didn't know any Isaac. I dug deeper, my hands shaking. More pictures. More of the boy. Then I found the newspaper clipping. Local boy missing. Isaac Callahan, age 7, last seen at family home. The date was over 40 years ago. And the house in the picture? It was this house. That night I locked my bedroom door. I told myself it was just an old story, a sad history. Nothing more. But at 2:13 a.m. I woke up, not because of a sound, because of the feeling. The room was ice cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. Then from the dark, "Dad?" The voice was closer this time, right outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, my pulse thundering. Slowly the handle turned, click, click, click. The door didn't open, but something was on the other side, waiting. Then I heard it, the closet door creaking open. I turned slowly, heart in my throat. In the dim glow of the nightlight, I saw a small figure standing inside, eyes wide, unblinking, watching me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The boy in the closet looked just like the photo. Dark hair, pale skin, hollow, sad eyes. He took a step forward. I flinched. "You're not real." His expression twisted, like he was trying to understand. "Why did you leave me?" My stomach clenched. "I didn't." Tears welled in his eyes. "You were supposed to come back." The room shook. The walls groaned. The air turned suffocating. And suddenly, I knew. Isaac wasn't just looking for his father. He was looking for any father. For me. The closet door slammed shut. The house groaned like something deep inside. It was waking up. I ran. I grabbed my keys, my wallet, and I ran. I haven't stepped foot in that house since. But sometimes late at night when I'm alone in my new apartment, I still hear it. Soft, hesitant. "Dad?" I never wanted this job. Working the night shift at a gas station on a remote desert highway wasn't exactly a dream come true, but after dropping out of college and burning bridges with my family, I didn't have many options. The pay was bad, the hours were worse, and the only company I had most nights was the flickering neon sign and the occasional drifter needing gas. It was a quiet job, until the night I saw him. It started at around 2 a.m. I was restocking cigarettes behind the counter when I glanced at the security monitors. A car was parked at pump number 3, but nobody was filling up, just sitting there. At first I thought it was empty. Then I saw him, an old man in a gray suit sitting perfectly still in the driver's seat, staring straight at the station. I waited for him to get out, but he didn't move, didn't even blink. 15 minutes passed, then 30. I kept glancing at the cameras, expecting him to drive off. But he just sat there, his face blank, eyes locked onto the glass doors. At the 1-hour mark, my unease turned into something worse. I grabbed the store phone and called dispatch. "Hey man," I said, "can you send a patrol car? There's this guy at pump number 3. He's been sitting there for an hour, not moving." The radio crackled. "Pump number 3, there's nobody there." I looked up at the monitor again. The car was still there. So was the old man. I turned slowly toward the glass doors. My stomach dropped. Outside, pump number 3 was empty. I barely made it through the rest of my shift. By morning, I was convinced I had imagined the whole thing. Sleep deprivation, boredom. Maybe I had stared at the cameras too long and my mind filled in the blanks. But then I heard about his death. His name was Walter Crane, an old drifter who used to live near the highway. Nobody really knew him, but he had been a regular at the station years ago, before my time. He would sit at pump number 3 for hours, never buying gas, never speaking much. People thought he was just lonely. He died 2 weeks ago, heart failure. And yet, 2 nights ago, I saw him sitting in his car. I didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? But something about it wouldn't leave me alone. I started asking around, trying to learn more about him. That's when I met her, Eva Crane, his granddaughter. She came into the station late one evening looking for someone to talk to. She had deep brown eyes, long black hair, and a sadness about her that made my chest ache. "You're the guy who saw him, aren't you?" she asked. I hesitated. "How do you know about that?" She smiled sadly. "You're not the first." Eva told me the truth. Walter Crane had been seen many times since his death. Sitting at pump number 3, standing on the side of the road, watching. "He never left," she whispered. "Not really." Her family had called a priest, Father Donovan, a man who had seen things he wouldn't talk about. I met him at the church 2 nights later. He was older, with tired eyes that had seen too much. He listened carefully as I told him what I saw. Then he sighed. "Walter Crane was a lost soul," he said, "and something is keeping him here." I shivered. "What does he want?" The priest frowned. "Maybe he doesn't know he's dead. Maybe he's looking for something. Or someone." I glanced at Eva, standing quietly by the door. I already knew what I had to do. Eva and I grew close in the weeks that followed. I don't know if it was because of the mystery surrounding her grandfather, or just the way she looked at me, like I was something more than just a gas station clerk. She told me stories about Walter, about how he used to drive out to the station every night, hoping to see someone, hoping to see her mother. Walter's daughter had died young, and he had never forgiven himself. That's why he always sat at pump number 3, waiting for her to come home. It broke my heart, but it also terrified me, because if he was waiting for someone, then what was he going to do when he realized she wasn't coming? We went to pump number 3 at midnight. Eva stood beside me, clutching a candle, her hands shaking. I whispered, "Walter, if you can hear me, it's time to go." Silence. Then, a car engine revving in the distance. I turned. My breath caught in my throat. There he was, sitting in his car, staring. Eva gasped. "Grandpa?" The air around us shifted. The car flickered like a bad signal on a TV screen. Walter's face twisted, not with anger, but with sadness. "I'm sorry," Eva whispered. "But she's not coming home." For the first time, Walter blinked. Then he was gone. The car, the sound, the feeling, all of it. Eva cried into my shoulder. I held her, knowing that for the first time in decades, Walter Crane had finally driven home. And he wasn't coming back.